Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So I have been sent several times a video of whom I believe a very sincere person advocating for stopping one's fasts in the morning at the solar depression decree of 18 degrees and then waiting to pray until 15 degrees in order for the prayer and the fast to be valid according to both of the opinions that are expressed on when true Fajr comes in according to calculations. Now, while I believe this person to be sincere and I believe advice is laudable, I think that there's a problem with the legal and logical consistency of this argument. Even brotherly advice must still be consistent according to the rules of the Sharia. The idea of precaution in the Sharia is, as some scholars have defined it, to take the strongest position to secure religious obligations. So an integral part of Islam is being cautious about the things that we do as acts of worship. However, that precaution also has to be legally and logically consistent with the rules of the Sharia. Precaution in the Sharia is not just a pious approach, it's not just a personal attitude, but it is one that is based upon the evidence of the Sharia as well. The problem here is that the idea of 18 degrees or 15 degrees are not textual. They are not found in the text of Islam. They are approximations by scholars throughout Islamic history to try and determine when the signs of true Fajr will most likely appear. And as such, they both rely on the same observable phenomenon. So by advocating for both, then what we're really saying is that one of them is valid and one of them is invalid, or we're broadening the scope of recommended actions beyond what is advocated in the Sunnah, and thus creating a hardship for the average worshipper that is a hardship which is negated in the Sharia. So using 18 degrees for fasting but 15 degrees for prayer is an inconsistent application of precaution. So what are the discernible, observable signs of true Fajr in the Sharia? Number one, a white horizontal glow that appears on the horizon and spreads across the sky. This is from Allah's statement, وَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا, to the end of the verse, that the true Fajr is not like the false Fajr. It is not a vertical glow, but it is a horizontal glow, one that spreads across the horizon, as found in the hadith of Abu Dawud and At-Tirmidhi. The true Fajr also increases gradually, as opposed to the sudden disappearance of the false Fajr. And lastly, the horizon is clearly distinguishable, allowing for a contrast between the night and the dawn, meaning that the khayt al-abyad min al-khayt al-aswad, the white thread from the black thread, is a distinguishable line on the horizon. Now, I'm not here to debate whether 18 or 15 degrees is more correct, as there's considerable debate about that already. Yes, 18 degrees has historical precedent. 15 degrees has observable precedent, empirical precedent. The problem is, when we are advocating for both, we fall into a logical inconsistency. So for determining true Fajr, either the phenomenon is directly observed and documented, or is calculated based on observable phenomenon. Therefore, you cannot have the same physical phenomenon happening at two different times, which is what 18 degrees and 15 degrees are. Now, it's important to note that classical scholars always anchored cyclical and reoccurring rulings, like prayer times, the beginning of lunar months, menses cycles, and other things, in visible, measurable phenomena. They did all of this to underscore the primacy of empirical proof in establishing Sharia rulings. And this is because a legal cause in the Sharia is generally defined as an external identifiable condition or an event that the Shari', the lawgiver, has designated as a trigger for a legal ruling. So when the condition arises, for example, seeing the crescent moon, then we fast the next day. Or the sun deviates from the zenith, we pray dhuhr. The relevant hukum, the relevant ruling, takes effect after the legal cause is identifiable and observable. Therefore, just as prayer is invalid before its time enters and fasting cannot begin while the night remains, the legal ruling does not exist without its sabab. The hukum, the legal ruling, does not exist without its sabab or legal cause. Fajr time and the beginning of the fast can only have one distinct legal cause, and that is the appearance of true Fajr. And this only happens when its distinguishing features are observed. Now, trying to reconcile two positions that are reliant on the same observable phenomenon but use different criteria creates an inherent contradiction. This is because the sabab, the legal cause for these obligations, is the appearance of the distinct horizontal glow that separates night from dawn. So adopting multiple thresholds undermines the consistency of Islamic legal reasoning and risks applying different rulings for the same empirical reality. Now, on the topic of ihtiyat, or precaution, Ibn al-Qayyim in Tahdhib al-Sunan mentions that ihtiyat, or precaution, should not be merely about taking the strictest position, but should align with what is legally and empirically established. And he says that if a person were to refuse to use water suspected of impurity, even though there is no definitive evidence, this would contradict the true essence of ihtiyat, and therefore the precaution here would be to not take that precaution, as that precaution is baseless in the Sharia. This reasoning applies here for the issue of Fajr. If empirical evidence establishes that Fajr is at 15 degrees, then 18 degrees as a precaution is not only an unnecessary burden, but it also is an illegitimate application of ihtiyat, or precaution. Lastly, there's an important issue called talfiq, and that is the amalgamation of Sharia rulings under one new ruling, where you take one or more opinions and you combine them to try and create a new opinion. Now, this is a topic of considerable discussion and debate amongst scholars of Islamic law. The Jordanian Fatwa Council has a very good, concise list of the rules for the application of what is permissible versus impermissible talfiq. First, they say the combined opinions should not contradict ijma', consensus, or an explicit text, nas, with a definitive meaning, or an evident qiyas jali, meaning a clear analogy. Second, the result should not create a scenario that neither of the original position allows in the same issue. Third, there must be a legitimate need for this amalgamation or talfiq. Therefore, it's impermissible to be done merely out of personal whim or desire, or to evade religious obligations or taking a position. Fourth, it must not contradict the maqasid of the Sharia or the higher objectives of Islamic law. And this here is really the point of my short video, and as I mentioned to some of you on comments, I do have a longer paper that I've been working on this topic. Attempting to reconcile the positions of 18 and 15 degrees, even in a manner simply as a recommendation or brotherly advice, is problematic, and it's a form of impermissible talfiq, or legal amalgamation. To use 18 degrees for one ruling, such as the entrance of fasting, or the entrance of fasting, and then 15 degrees for the start of the salah, violates the second condition that was mentioned, which is that combining these two things should not create a scenario that neither of the two scholars or groups of scholars involved would ever allow. Another thing is that it goes against the specific explicit texts, as we have a number of explicit texts about what the signs of true Fajr are. Saying that it's 15 for this and 18 for that would seem to say that these observable phenomena should happen twice, and that's incorrect. Both of these calculations are an attempt to speak on the same legal cause, i.e. observable dawn. Selecting different thresholds creates an outcome that no position allows in full. The Sharia is based on consistent legal reasoning, especially in matters of ibadat, of worship. So if one uses 18 for prayer and 15 for fasting, or 15 for fasting and 18 for prayer, this creates a disjointed legal framework where the same sabab, true dawn, results in two different rulings. If we're going to use 18, then that means that Fajr starts earlier, so fasting should also start at that time. And if we're going to use 15, then that means that dawn has not actually begun at 18, contradicting its use for other things. We have to remain logically consistent. No school allows for the prayer to begin at a time when fasting has not begun, and vice versa. Both must be tied to the same observable phenomenon that are mentioned in the hadith. Therefore, if someone intentionally chooses one threshold for prayer and another for fasting to accommodate ease or preference, this is a way of exploiting legal opinions that distorts their intended application. It places a hardship on people who are trying to navigate two different times, thinking that they might fall into invalidity because of either of the two. Permissible legal amalgamation, where permissible at-talfiq al-jaiz, is one that should aid worshippers in maintaining the Sharia's objectives, but using two separate calculations for the same observable natural phenomenon leads to unnecessary confusion, and it weakens the certainty or the predominant presumption, the ghalabat al-dhann, that is necessary for religious obligations. Instead of easing the ibadat, the inconsistency creates doubts about when prayer is valid and when fasting begins, and this contradicts the objectives of the Sharia, ensuring clarity in worship. In conclusion, while I do advocate for people to follow their local scholarship in determining their prayer times in the beginning of their months and their fasting times, so on and so forth, there is no room for combining two seemingly similar but actually opposed rulings under the guise of precaution. True Fajr has known, definable, and observable signs. Attempting to combine 18 and 15 degrees is a denial of that reality, an attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable. And I would ask everyone is choose a lane and stick with it. Choose the one that you trust, that you have the most yaqeen, most certainty in, and stick with that. And then focus on making your Ramadan successful on that standard. Don't worry about the differences of opinion if you're not a legal scholar. Don't involve yourself in the back and forth. Choose one, trust those scholars, and then do what you're supposed to be doing in Ramadan, which is attempting to make the most of the fast so as لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that perchance you can gain taqwa. وَصَلَّى اللَّهُ وَسَلَّمَ عَلَى نَبِيِّنَا